What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So we're in the aftermath of UFC 319, and people are discussing the dominance of the fight. They're saying that Chimaev's win over Duplessis is perhaps the most dominant win they've ever seen, or at least it's the most dominant win they've seen in a UFC title fight. And I feel like there's some nuance here because, yes, it was dominant in a sense. It was dominant in the sense that, you could possibly score like 4 of the rounds 10-8. And that's pretty dominant by most people's standards. And I'm kind of open to that because I do think control time matters, and I do think that we need to score more 10-8 rounds. I hate that, we can have such a gap where one 10-9 round, a guy barely, he lands like 2 more jabs and he wins a 10-9 round. And then on the other hand, you can have rounds like we saw on Saturday, and that'll be scored at 10-9 too. And just the gap in what the winner versus the loser of those rounds are doing are just not the same. So I think we do need to score more 10-8 rounds. So I'm fine if you want to score that fight like 50-41 or something. But at the same time, not a lot happened. Meaning, once the dominant positions were secured, virtually no damage occurred and no submission attempts occurred. Khamzat is not credited with a single submission attempt. Dricus actually is, which is hilarious. In the 5th, he is credited with one. But Khamzat landed, I checked it, I believe it was 37 significant strikes. Because people talk about, he landed 500 strikes. Yeah, they were all insignificant. Over 90% of the strikes he landed were insignificant strikes. Were door-knocking strikes that barely do anything, that count for basically nothing, and that aren't exciting to watch, and that aren't a display of dominance of any kind. That's about as dominant of a strike as Kamaru Usman stepping on your foot. Or, remember when Kamaru Usman, I think it was Damian Maia, where Damian's on his back and his legs are up, and Kamaru's standing over him and he grabs his ankle and he hammer fists his foot? That's that kind of strike. Okay, those are the kinds of strikes Khamzat's landing all the fight. He only lands 37 significant strikes. And there's a problem with that because not only can we look at other champions, other dominant champions, other champions who were criticized for being boring, who were criticized for going the distance too often, and we can compare some of their fights to that fight. And on top of that, there's just a philosophical question at the core of this, which is, if it's so dominant, why can't you do anything? If it's so dominant, if you're so much better than this guy, why can't you hurt him? If you're so much better than this guy, why can't you submit him? If you're so much better than this guy, why can't you even get close to submitting him? If you're so much better than this guy, why can't you take any fucking risks? Think about it. Because if you just go back and look at Fight Metric, and you look at Georges St-Pierre, even in some of his boring fights, even in some of his decisions, even in the John Fitch fight, for example, he lands over 100 significant strikes. And he's getting a lot of takedowns. The Dan Hardy fight, he's landing, I think it was twice as many significant strikes as Khamzat did, and he's getting 6 submission attempts, including an armbar that was so fucking close that it's a kind of a miracle Hardy escaped it. That's what Pierre was doing, and people are calling him boring. Or look at Demetrius Johnson. He has one of the, he's tied with Holloway for the latest finish in UFC history when he submitted Kyoji Horiguchi in the 5th round with 1 second left. He had fights like that. He had fights like that against Wilson Hayes and some other guys where he comfortably was mauling them and he was getting the better of them on the ground, but he was doing damage, he was working them over, and then he went for the finish late. Or look at the Ray Borg fight, where he gets the suplex to armbar. He could have just sailed to a decision because he was comfortably winning, but he said, hey, I want to finish this guy. It'll be cool if I finish this guy, and I am able to. I'm able to go for this. I'm able to, open myself up a little and go for some actual offense, and I'm not worried that he's going to be able to beat me just because I do that. Because if you're that worried, if you're that conservative, if you're that, if you're so much tiptoeing around the idea of opening up at all, of losing any control so that you can go for any meaningful offense, then how dominant are you really? How? So, on the one hand, yes, not a competitive fight. On the one hand, yes, you could have given him fucking 4 10-8 rounds. Yes, that's all well and good. On the other hand, if you're so much better, if you're so dominant, why can't you do anything? Just look at Cain Velasquez versus Junior Dos Santos. I believe that's the first fight where a guy lands the first one, not the rematch, or not the first one that Kane wins. The second fight, not the trilogy match. I believe that's the first fight in UFC history where a guy lands both over 100 significant strikes and over 100 over 100 significant strikes and over 10 takedowns. And I think that was only matched later by Kamaru Usman versus RDA. I believe that's like the first time another fighter matched those numbers. And just look at that fight. Just look at most of that fight's on the feet. Like, Kane's in his face, he's putting him up against the fence, he's beating him up, but he scores a knockdown in the first round, and he's doing meaningful damage. And then the third fight goes the same way, but he gets the finish at the end. Just look at that. Look at TJ Dillashaw versus Renan Barão in both fights. He's on the feet and he's mauling him. He's getting the better of all the exchanges. He's outlanding him 2-1, and he gets finishes in both fights. And he's scoring knockdowns in both fights. Like, how can you look at those? How can you look at Mighty Mouse versus, again, against Horiguchi, against Wilson Hayes, against Ray Borg? How can you look at these fights? And how can you even look at some of Pierre's decisions and then look at this and just say it's the most dominance I've ever seen? You know, like, would it also be dominant if it were just a Jake Shields fight? If it were just Khamzat holding him against the fence the entire time and just landing little knees to his thighs and getting that back body lock and landing little knees to the back of his thighs? If that were the whole fight, if it were just 24 minutes of that, and Dricus just couldn't escape, he just couldn't reverse off the cage, he just couldn't break the grip, he just couldn't fight hands, he couldn't escape the body lock, but that's all it was. There was no takedowns, and the only strikes landed were like little pitter-patter knees to the thigh. Would you also call that the most dominant fight you'd ever seen just because Dricus didn't do anything either?